During my school years, I was reading memoirs and biographies of great surgeons through the history of the medical profession. And my intention was to become a medical doctor, a surgeon, and as I was pretty good at school, I would have had no problem entering the medical school. But something happened that I cannot recall or even theorize today. I walked into the architecture school and entered entrance examinations. And there I was. I became very deeply involved in architecture right away. At the time when I began my studies in 1957, architects were big heroes in my country, in Finland, because of the war, disasters of the war. Architects were heroes on two fronts. Design and architecture were the two art forms or dimensions of Finnish culture that attracted international recognition, and consequently architects and designers were considered as heroes who built up the identity of a country that had suffered badly in the war. But at the same time, of course, because there was a lot of physical reconstruction after the war, architects also served the purpose of, were associated with the reconstruction, which of course was positive in everybody's mind. So we were sort of double heroes, or not me, but architects of the previous generation. So it was immediately a great privilege and honor to become part of that tradition. And there were great large-size drawings by my great countryman Eliel Saarinen, who then had immigrated to America in 1923 after the Chicago Tribune tower competition. And those drawings were so, I was so impressed by them that I just started to be completely drawn into the architectural world. And through my life, I have, in a way, taken the architect's training and background more as a way of living a meaningful life than as a profession or a means of making money. And I have continuously expanded the field of applying architectural thought and approach to various arts and social phenomena, landscape, even political, views and concerns. So, as far as I'm concerned, everything can be looked at an architect's eyes, and that's what I teach to my students usually. Not what architecture is, but how an individual can live one's life meaningfully, looking at the world at an architect's eyes or through.
Sounds like something Leonardo would say. Leonardo da Vinci.
Yes. I don't know. My further earlier background is in farm life. During the war years, I stayed with my farmer grandfather on his very modest farm in central Finland, and in those days farm life was rather demanding because everyone needed to know everything necessary in daily life and have the capacity to do all kinds of jobs. And as I have often said, I never heard anyone ask the other, can you do this? It was always not even do this, because everyone understood his or her role in the family, and just, a way that someone, my grandfather, looked at my eyes, I knew I should do this or that job, and that sort of caught on me, and I haven't been able to obey or respect boundaries too much in my life. But I do not have false pretensions about my capacities. I'm simply curious, and the curiosity drives me still, and I feel that the best way of eliminating the negative consequences of aging is to maintain your sense of curiosity.
Did you ever return to medicine with this attitude? Did you ever come back to medical?
Well, in a way, I did. In a way, I have made a circle. I have collaborated 30 years with therapists, and I have understood that therapists and architects work on very similar problems, and that is man's self-understanding, and trying to make that self-understanding positive and favorable and optimistic. Architect works in the physical end and large-scale end, whereas the therapist works in the inner mental end and intimate end, but I think it's the same continuum. In that sense, I think that I have been able to somewhat unite the two desires.
I'd like to rest just a bit at the beginning of the story and these issues of heroism. Starting with Reconstruction, can you tell us just a bit about how people were thinking about Reconstruction in Finland, rebuilding, what it meant to be building after the war in Finland when you entered architectural study and architectural practice?
It meant optimism and hope, and also a strong belief in modernity. My country was one of the last countries to urbanize and industrialize in the entire Europe, because we were a country of forestry and agriculture earlier. But then once these processes began in the 1920s, internationalism and modernity became the unquestioned lifestyle, and even an ideal to a certain degree. And I don't think there is a country where modernity would have had such a wide and deep acceptance early on as our country, which has, of course, colored and also the later development. And for instance, in my own case, my parents did not have any particular artistic background or even relationship with arts, but we had Bauhaus, inspired furniture in our home, and I remember I as a child, I admired the shining chrome furniture, and this was very much the childhood of I would not say most kids of my age, but very many.
why do you think that happened? I mean, I can imagine people, traditional farming people, hanging on to the furniture they were familiar with, making a kind of virtue of traditionalism and age. I remember my German landlady in Münster talking about the family Hof preserving, great, Schränke, the great kind of clothes hamper things, going back as far as the family went back. And this was something she was kind of clutching to her bosom as proof that her family was not one of these who'd been swept away by modern things. Why is it so? Is it different in Finland?
I may not be able to say why it is different, but it is different. Traditionalism gained ground only after 1970s. Then building conservation and all of that consciousness of historical heritage in terms of architecture and surroundings gained wider understanding. But until that, anything that was new was considered positive, because the view was always and the desire was beyond. It was not where we were, but something beyond. And I think it came from the fact that as I said earlier, we were a agricultural and forestry country. So once we began to live in towns and cities, it shifted also the mental attitude towards a somewhat futuristic perspective. And then also I would say there's a curious similarity or same ground in vernacular peasant aesthetic values, which are no decoration, everything is simple, well proportioned, a little bit like Shaker aesthetics in America. And there was a kind of a ethical dimension in peasant aesthetics, the idea of noble simplicity. That is almost the same idea as in modernism from 1920s onwards. It also believed in noble simplicity or noble poverty. So the transition from peasant views and values to modernist views was quite natural.
You mentioned that in the 70s there was a kind of renewed appreciation of traditional values, preservation, and so forth. Was there a shift in your own thinking as an architect?
Yes.
What happened to your own trajectory as you sort of? I mean, I take it early on you were embracing this future-oriented attitude. What happened there?
Well, I think the general awakening to the values of history in surroundings came as a result of the loss of local identity or ambience because too much was built within a couple of decades, and I think our country was, or I remember, the European country where the average age of buildings was newest, which means that modernity took over perhaps too quickly, and then people, including myself, who was already an architect at that time, realized that our identity cannot be, created immediately or attached or projected to a completely new environment. We are historical beings, and many people felt certain nostalgia of the peasant background, including again myself. I remembered my childhood years at my grandfather's farm with joy and gratitude and certain nostalgia. And my values changed very much in the beginning of 70s, partly as a consequence of the student revolution and all that, what happened after Paris Spring in 1968. But also I spent more than 2 years as a professor in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. And that exposure to the third world and the problems and realities there shook off my utopian ideals and belief in Western rationality and universality of values, and all that was shaken off while I was in Africa.
So you were no longer as enthusiastic about progress as you had been earlier?
No, I thought progress was a linear process, but then I realized that it might not be a linear process, and there are, side currents, and still are in the development of Western industrialized countries, which might not be beneficial for humankind. So I began to be more critical about that, and I became critical of rationality. I had been admired rationality, but after that I realized that maybe it's better to react to the world as a complete human being, including one's emotions and one's sense of self from early childhood onwards, than believing in the somewhat one-dimensional idea of rational judgment.
Was this partly a recovery of memory? I mean, had you, during this earlier point, actually forgotten?
Yes.
Your
yes, you are very right. Yes, it was a recovery of memory and reactivation of experiences in my memory from farm life. And I realize now, at the age of 73 and a half, that my thinking is very strongly grounded in those early childhood experiences. And also the fact that I've traveled 50 years around the world, perhaps more than any other architect in my country, but at the same time my Finnish identity has become stronger and stronger. When I travel and fall asleep in a hotel room on the other side of the globe, I usually, before I fall asleep, have repeatedly the same image, and that is sunlight being reflected from the surface of a lake, and that penetrates through the vertical dark, staccato rhythm of trees and hits my eyes, and then I fall asleep. So I have thought that this is my screen-saving image, the Finnish lake landscape.
You spoke about the way the architect's way of thinking, or the architectural way of thinking, as something that is applied not just to architecture but
Yes.
to many areas. Can you say a bit about what that way of thinking is?
It is a relational manner of thinking. I don't regard architecture as an object or a finality. For me, architecture always mediates between things. It mediates between landscape and human domicile. It mediates between cosmic dimensions, I think even today, but of course very clearly back in history. But it also mediates between human beings, between human institutions and the individual. And for me, architecture is primarily, the task of architecture is to give a structure and meaning to our existence, in the sense that it frames the way that we understand culture and ourselves. I think we remember who we are very much because of the built environment. If we just make the quick subjective experiment of eliminating the built environment, who are we? That question would become a huge question, because our past and origins are given to us through heritage landscape and urban landscape.
So the earliest example of that mediation is the house and barn and the place you grew up.
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
say a bit of how that worked there?
Well, one example was the table in the farmer's house, which was basically one room where also food was made and eaten, and the table. In that table, everyone had his or her position. My grandfather was always sitting at the end of the table, and any visitor would come through the door, and then there was a bench, and he or she would sit on the bench without saying anything. After some while, my grandfather would invite the visitor to, come to the table and join the meal. I realized early on as a child how the table was a kind of an organizing center of the farmer's world. It pointed out hierarchies and ways of behavior. Also the courtyard between the cow house and the sauna and various farm structures. I realized that this space was something that organized both experiences and behavior. The court was entered between a rather narrow space between the cow house and the sauna building, and that gateway was marked the entry and also became the threshold between the farmhouse, intimacy of the farmhouse, and then the larger world. The attic, where there were old newspapers and discarded objects, was my first library and museum. I was fascinated by finding those objects, partly buried in sawdust that was used as insulation in the Finnish farmhouse. Through experiences like this, I realized how the mental world and the physical world are interwoven.
I was just remembering my grandparents' house, which is another old farmhouse, and one feature of it was that because they had hired women and hired men, it had two upstairs, accessible from different doors.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I mean, it could have been just one hall, but
Yes.
they wanted to keep people separate. And so the place had this sense of richness. I mean, no house I knew had two upstairs, but
Mm-hmm.
this one
Yes.
did. And
Yes.
For some reason, that made a huge impression on me
Yes.
growing up.
Yeah.
And that house is still... Do you have houses that haunt your dreams?
Yes. Yes. I guess as an architect, I have more house dreams than people don't normally have, and I'm often reminded of Carl Jung's famous dream of a layered house, which was he realized was a metaphor of his mind from the top floor of the house down to the cellar, which went deeper and deeper into his unconscious. My dream houses are often huge combinations of old and new, and they are always half done, and I have a little frustration in my dream that I have not been able to finish my new house or renovate the new part completely. Yes, I think there is a strong metaphoric connection between our images of our own body and then the house. And it's a two-way symbolization or metaphor. The house is a metaphor of the mind, and the mind is or the self is a metaphor of the house, so it goes two ways.
Do you always have uncontested ownership of the house in your dreams?
Well, just a few nights ago I had an architect's bad dream. I came to our summer house and my wife had given the permission to the neighbors to alter the house. And when I altered the scene, I said, "Come on, I'm an architect by education. You shouldn't be, changing my house." And I began to tear down what the neighbors had naively added to my house. Usually I have full control of the house, but in this case the neighbors took over.
You're very lucky. My house is always in someone else's possession. I have to visit it surreptitiously or be allowed in to see the places I'm fond of.
Mm.
And there's even any serious question as to whether I ever had full claim to it.
Mm.
Maybe that's the price one pays for the United States house experience without the roots that one hasn't been.
Well, my dream houses usually extend very far. There are layers, room and room after room, and it gets more and more unfinished or historical. So there's a very clear correspondence with Jung's dream house, but Jung's history went in a vertical direction, mine goes in a horizontal direction.
Do you ever find yourself in dreams passing rapidly through other people's houses, sort of moving from house to house? I'm reminded by what you're saying of how prominent architecture is in my own dream life, but I was wondering, that's another motif that's very frequent for me.
I can't remember such dreams, but you are very right. That shows the importance of architecture, that it is so frequently appears in dreams, but also it's hardly possible to read a novel or look at a film which would not have architectural, elements about it, or look at early Renaissance paintings for that matter. There's always an architectural context. So human life simply takes place in the context of architecture. We tend to belittle the role of our houses and build structures, but everything takes place within architecture, even to the degree that, at least for me, it's impossible to think clearly outdoors. I have to be enclosed in a room to think clearly and do my work. I can't write sitting out in the sun. No, it's totally impossible.
So, is there one thing or one nest of things that our buildings should do for us? Or, I mean, is there some sort of a purpose?
Yes.
That an architect needs to serve the way a potter needs to serve the purpose of making sure that the thing holds water.
Yes. Well, in a way, I could use the same metaphor. The architect must make sure that the house, if I'm speaking of a house, contains the dweller, including his, memories and dreams and desires. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard makes the point that one of the chief benefits of a house is that it permits us to dream in peace and protected. I see houses having, of course, utilitarian, practical functions, but also mental functions and social or collective functions, and all those are equally important. And in a way, I think that our relationship with our home is somewhat erotic. It's charged with some meanings which have an erotic dimension to them. I have written about, for instance, the eroticism of space, and contemporary settings tend to be so rational and hard-edged that they do not permit or invite these kind of images, whereas old settings and profound modern architecture, I think, allows and stimulates fantasy. For me, the tactile experience is a very important experience in architecture, and much of contemporary architecture is purely retinal. It does not invite anyone to touch the surfaces or edges, and consequently we tend to live in a visual world, whereas we used to live in a tactile world, and also an oral world, a world of hearing more than of vision.
Yes, the hearing part is subtle, but you hear people. I mean, acoustic engineers understand it, but I'm not sure architects and houses think that way.
I think good architects understand that too, because a good architect measures the work he's doing by himself. The building becomes so strongly internalized that you sort of check it through all your senses and instincts and your embodied being in the world. But I would say this is what a profound architect does. I know there are many architects out there who take architectural design simply as a professional service, as a lawyer would do.
But the profound architect is the idea that that person produces a space in which he or she can live richly.
Yes.
And measures the space by how conducive it is to living richly,
yes.
given that he or she is a large enough soul
yes.
to have dimension.
Yes. Well, I often say that the genuine process of designing a house, if I were to design a house for you, would not go by asking you questions and then trying to satisfy those questions, but early on in the process internalizing you so that I become you. And then after that has happened, I'm able to design for myself and as I said, measure and test everything by my own capacities. And in the end of the process, I donate the building to you, the real dweller. There are interesting exchanges, I think, in any creative work, but particularly in architects' work. And one of the architect's great capacities, I think, is compassion. If an architect doesn't have compassion, in my view, he's unable to design satisfactory spaces.
And in this instance, it's compassion for the particular person who's commissioning the work.
Yes, but it's also compassion for human being in general. Or that's when we design, townscape or buildings, apartment buildings for unknown dwellers. You have to have sort of generalized compassion, but the compassionate ingredient has to be there.
I've always thought that the building we're sitting in comes off pretty well on that scale. Somebody thought about it more than most. I'm not sure I'm right.
Yeah. Well, one aspect which makes a difference is that buildings used to be made by human hands, and the presence of the human hand and those slow processes tend to make them more humane than today's industrialized processes and speed. And then in today's building, often you hardly can have a sense of compassion, because compassion has to be pointed at the other. But so often architectural tasks nowadays are totally anonymous. They are investment projects rather than tasks of inhabiting human beings, in their lives.
So how do you educate an architect in compassion?
Through exercises that bring out your understanding and concern for the other. I think that can be educated just as well as any other human capacity. And for me, teaching architecture is much more about trying to emancipate the student's sense of self, and self-respect, and a understanding that eventually he or she will be the final authority. In real life, you can't go to a teacher or your father or mother to ask whether I'm right. You have to be assured yourself that you are right. So teaching for me is very much a matter of thinking processes, but then also ethical concerns and compassion.
So becoming a better human being and a richer human being is the core of architectural education.
I would say definitely, because architecture deals with human values. What other ground could human values have than human wisdom and understanding and concern for the other? I know that today's architectural values are rather formalistic, and in that formalistic world one can get rather far with egocentric attitudes and even narcissistic attitudes. But if we think of an architecture that really does its mediating job or role, then I think we are bound to think that architecture arises from humane qualities and understanding.
I'm interested in this idea of mediation, and you went through rather quickly before some of the items that were mediated between. And I can understand, and I can get to sort of the first stage here, when mediates between people. You have your table, it mediates between people. It gives the person who comes into the kitchen a place to be and a place to aspire to.
But in the same way, architecture mediates between the landscape, defines your place. Even the world at large, architecture provides you your place, and that is a comforting experience, because we experience the world from the center point that we ourselves inhabit, and architecture reinforces that connection between place and the individual. So, but it also mediates between weather, light, the seasons, etc., the natural world. All of that is articulated and served to individuals through, our constructed world.
I remember growing up in a little town in Minnesota which had very little thought put into its buildings, with a couple of exceptions. And the major exception in my life was the library, which was the most beautiful building I'd ever seen. I think it may, I've seen some Romanesque cathedrals that might match it, but I don't think anything has ever hit me as powerful as this library.
Yeah. Libraries are fantastic spaces also for me, because when you step in a library, you really become part of a wide, large collective. You are in direct connection with past and some of the greatest souls of humankind by just picking a book by Shakespeare or Dostoevsky or whomever. You start to communicate with that monumental individual. That's what libraries are about, and I feel very good always being in a library.
Have you ever designed one?
I have not designed a specific library, but I have designed libraries within buildings that I have designed. I would love to design a library.
Well, make sure, if you design it, that there's a basement for children with a back stairs that only some children on rare occasions are allowed to go up to the adult part. That much I know about how to do a good library.
Yes.
I have a chance to talk to a great architect about my one little idea.
No, that's a great idea. I think we tend to be patronizing when designing for children, in the sense of trying to make designs that we think would please children. Children want to be adults. They want to imitate adults. They want to peek into the adults' world. And your advice, I think, makes perfect sense to my understanding.
Yes, it certainly made sense to my psychology. The day I was allowed to go up the stairs, although I was not quite old enough to look in the adult part of the library, was a very important day.
In these conversations with Lee Fondakovsky, I have pointed out the importance of boredom, which is an aspect where parents and teachers also nowadays tend to go wrong by overstimulating children. So children need to be bored, because only through boredom one begins to invent and discover things and develop an imagination. I have deliberately bored my children, or allowed them to be bored, because I'm grateful for my childhood during the war years, when the world was that of boredom. There was no outside, mechanical stimulation, no radio, no television, no newspapers. You had to invent your pastime.
Well, as I've been thinking about buildings and mediation, I've been running through my memories of buildings, and libraries come first. But then I also was remembering going with a young teen to court. You don't enter a courtroom very often, and for a normal person, it's a very scary thing to enter into the legal system in any way. I'm wondering if you've thought about how that mediation goes. These buildings it is that people don't enter very often, but they almost always enter with fear.
Yes. Well, of course, architecture makes human institutions and value systems and hierarchies explicit. So that is one of the tasks of architecture, to give certain institutions their sense of authority, like the courthouse. And I think it's appropriate. I do not at all believe in a world without hierarchies. Hierarchies are a way of structuring our experiences, and architecture serves that purpose. Church, for instance, has to have the authority of the church, and certain mental distance from everyday life or the street life.
I think my biggest architectural surprise was when I was called on a jury once. And so I was sitting in a courtroom, and they were cross-examining witnesses. And I was struck by how small it is, and that I was having more face time with the female attorney than I had had with my wife in the last year, because she was this close to me, And I thought, this is a very strange space. So I came from this huge space where jurors are selected and people are brought in, and there are all these signs about how you're to behave, into this very intimate space where the matters are actually decided.
That's again architectural mediating between big and small, public and private, important and less important, festive and everyday, etc., etc. All those are architecturally mediated.
I'm conscious of your next responsibility. I'd like to leave you a little time to relax before you need to speak.
Well, actually, I'm just listening to other people talk at 4, so
it's a little more relaxed.
Okay.
Well, let's maybe then. We're at a university, and I'm wondering how you understand the mediating task of things like classrooms, laboratories, that kind of space.
My view of university as an institution is that it has to liberate us and make us critical and free thinkers. I'm not at all interested in the idea, or I don't approve with the idea that universities become like vocational schools that directly prepare students for particular professions. In my view, a good architecture school primarily trains young people as thinkers about architecture and an architectural way of thinking. And when they learn that, the practicalities of the profession are rather easy to learn. So I would always, and I have always emphasized the intellectual, emotional dimensions in university education, and particularly the ethical aspect. Universities should make us ethically perceptive and strong.
Have any of those ideas found their way into design? I mean, have you designed for universities?
No, I have been in the juries for a couple of university competitions, but I have not designed a university. I have designed a couple of schools, yes.
Well, schools would be the same kind of problem. I mean, how to make that ideal live in a space.
Yes, yes. Well, it's evident that architecture can either reinforce authority or authoritative attitudes, or then it can support democratic attitudes, or emphasize the in the individual point of view. And all of these, I think, can be consciously dealt with in school design. It's hard to now concretize this matter further, but those are all issues that an architect would, run through his mind.
I think of the traditional British schools where folks are so proud of them having been there for 500 years, but perhaps the first thing one would need to do would be not to have schools that have been there for 500 years. Because invariably the tradition then becomes venerable. I mean, when you realize the kind of ideal you're talking.
Well, I have been professor of architecture in a number of countries and dean of an architecture school, and I have taught usually first and second year students, and I think those are the most important years. The first week is important, the first day is important, because in the first day of university you can set a curiosity and fire in a young person's soul, or then you can, frustrate him or her forever. And so the interest has to be opened right away in the very beginning, and that's very much the task of at least education in architecture, is to get that self-interest, self-motivated interest and curiosity.
Thank you so much for your time and help on these matters, and I hope you have a good rest of the visit here.
Thank you. You are welcome.